social media as laboratory. Please help me welcome Professor.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Angel, for that really wonderful introduction. As I told several of the graduate students today, I'm excited to be back here in Nebraska. Nebraska is the first, Omaha is actually the first city I visited in the United States. I drove here with my father from Toronto via Chicago, and I remember being amazed by the cornfields, but wondering where Big Bird, Ernie, and the Crouch were. So today we've been asked to look at post-truth futures, right? To think about what is the future of truth, veracity, etc. in the era of fake news and global disinformation networks. Now I'm going to take on this question by asking a slightly different one. So here's the questions I want us to contemplate for today. So what futures do post-truth put in place? And how do post-truths construct and constrict the future? And I'll ask these questions because I want us to move beyond fake news. I want us to move beyond disinformation to what counts as truth, what literally counts as truth in the era of big data. So I want us to think through what data analytics constructs and counts as true. And big data, I'll suggest, makes the truth post. So it makes the truth something that comes after, precisely because it also comes before. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Well, consider again all that hype around big data. Right? Big data, we were told over and over again, changes everything. The economists called it the new oil, the fuel for the second information revolution. Why? Well, according to this rather controversial Wired article, big data is so big because it kills theory, because it kills the scientific method. It puts theory across all disciplines into crisis. It's not just the humanities then that's on edge. Far less controversially, Kuchner and Meyer-Schonenberger have argued that big data displaces causality. So big data is so radical because it moves us from the why to the how. So instead of hypothetical causes, it gives us real correlations, actually existing correlations, proxies for certain behaviors, and these correlations allow us to predict the future. Right? So as you can see here, they claim that knowledge is now about knowing the future rather than the past. So we would seem to live in an era then of pre-truth rather than post-truth. Maybe. But if we do, we have to ask ourselves why and how. What needs to be in place? What world are we living in that this is possible? Which brings me to part one, authenticating fake news. Okay. So, what is fake news and why should you care? A commonly accepted definition of fake news, especially within journalism, is this. So news articles that are intentionally and verifiably false and could mislead readers. Fake news is usually linked to the events of 2016, in particular Brexit and the US presidential elections, where it allegedly had political implications. It's also, as is noted here, linked to satire gone wrong. This is why The Onion is actually listed as one of the top fake news sites. And it's also linked to the clickbait economy. Right? So fake news brings together markets, fiction, and politics. Now, as many have pointed out, fake news isn't new. In fact, you could create a meme out of this. Right? And almost every single article on fake news repeats the fact that fake news is not new. Right? Most refer back to the era of yellow journalism, hoaxes and satire, so the beginnings of mass media. This is a little more dramatic, and argues that rumor and false stories have probably been around as long as humans have lived in groups where power matters. Okay? Although not new, almost every news story links fake news to the events of 2016. So not accidentally, post-truth was the 2016 Oxford English Dictionary Word of the Year. And I'm just going to show you a bit of that clip.
Post-truth. British politics was dominated this year by the Brexit referendum. In America, it was the presidential election. Both campaigns caused spikes in the usage of the phrase post-truth. That is, when objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. The phrase could now take on an even wider importance. It describes not just particular assertions, but a general characteristic of our age. And its usage in 2016 has sat overwhelmingly alongside just one other now, cementing the idea of post-truth politics. The truth, lamented one British newspaper commentator recently, has become so devalued that what was once the gold standard of political debate is a worthless currency. Brexit.
Okay. So post-truth has been linked to the general devaluing of truth, an appeal to emotions or truthiness. And it's also been considered important because it sows general mistrust and general cynicism. It takes up a lot of bandwidth. Fake news is also linked to conspiracy theories that won't die, such as Pizzagate. And as Liz Losh has explained, Pizzagate comes from the treasure trove of hacked DNC emails. So in this treasure trove, there's one email that refers to a handwritten note on a napkin in a pizza parlor. Right? And this has been examined over and over again and decrypted in order to find the secret code. Right? So I think pepperoni allegedly means male child. Right? And this conspiracy theory won't go away, even though it's been debunked a million times. What this passage also brings up is that fake news isn't just political, and it's not just linked to one ideological position. Right? So Carl Miller, who recently visited fake news merchants in Kosovo, revealed that these were the hottest trending fake news stories. So if this is fake news, how should we respond? What should we do? The initial response to fake news is to expose what's fake, right? To create lists of fake news stories and to disseminate these. So this is BuzzFeed's 2016 top trending fake news stories. And these are their 2017 stories. Although important, there's real problems with verification. Most obviously, there's a time lag, right? So there's a few fact-checking sites against a whole massive network of disinformation sites. And fact-checking sites will always lag behind these networks. Also, debunked stories don't reach the same audience. Right? So as Silverman points out, debunked stories only reach a third of the audience of the initial story. But not only that, there are separate audiences for debunked stories and fake news stories. Now, one solution to this that's been embraced by social media companies is AI and automation. So as this recent New York Times editorial points out, Facebook is turning to AI. Right? So Zuckerberg told us, no fear, a solution is on its way. If not next year, then at least over a 5 to 10 year period, machine learning will take care of this problem for us. But this approach has real limitations. First of all, most operate at the level of the keyword. So this can be, as they point out, somewhat useful. Statistically speaking, certain patterns of language may indeed be associated with dubious stories. For instance, for a long time, most articles that included the words Brad, Angelina, and divorce turned out to be unreliable tabloid fare. Okay, but as they pointed out, Brad and Angelina did get divorced. And most stories actually mix what's true and false. And they make this point through a recent story on the Boy Scouts, right? So this was the fake news bit. It was the Boy Scouts have decided to accept people who identify as gay and lesbian among their ranks, and girls are welcome now too into the iconic organization, which has renamed itself Scouts BSA. So what's next? A mandate that condoms be made available to all participants of its global gathering. Now, they argue that this story is mainly false because they got the causality wrong. So condoms have indeed been available at the global gathering, and the Boy Scouts organization indeed have come to accept girls as well as gays and lesbians into its ranks, but the causal relationship doesn't exist, right? So the condom policy originated in 1992. So they argue AIs are really bad at catching these sort of false causalities. Yes, but even if we could verify things, even if we could check things against the past, what would change? What does knowing that something is fake do? Right? After all, people find satire, they find fiction, they find films compelling and true, even though they can't be correct or incorrect. And in fact, numerous studies have shown that verification alone is not enough. In fact, debunking can actually backfire. Right? So debunking can actually spark more interest than the initial fake news item. So Adam Berinsky has argued that directly refuting rumors makes these rumors more powerful. It increases their fluency. Merely repeating a rumor increases its strength. Repetition and the sense of familiarity it breeds are one of the ways in which rumors gain power. It can also backfire because calling something false can reinforce a person's deep-seated views, especially if they don't trust you. Right? So corrections can reinforce opinions of those who are already suspicious of power. For instance, a bunch of people who were highly against inoculation were told that an initial study they had read was false, and this made them even more determined not to inoculate. And what's absolutely key is the economics of fake news. It's part of what's called the clickbait economy that takes advantage of the way advertising bids operate online. So fake news was actually first linked to hackers in Macedonia who figured out how to take advantage of the difference between Facebook and Google ads, right? So you click on something in Facebook, it takes you to a website where you get ads from Google. Now what's key is that these hackers, they don't have a horse in the game. They don't care what they spread. They only care that it spreads. And it's not just Macedonian hackers. Silverman has pointed out that journalism itself has a vexed relationship to rumors, right? It thrives off breaking news, off scoops. The mainstream media itself spread unverified information. And so, entrepreneurs and journalists have called for revising the advertising structure of the internet to move away from click-based models that foster what they call junk content farming. And this is a quotation from the New York magazine called "The Internet Apologizes." This is also why several organizations, such as the Public Data Lab, have argued that fake news needs to be defined in terms of how it circulates. So it needs to be defined in terms of its viral spreadability. What makes fake news, in other words, is its circulation, is its modes of online diffusion and its capacity to saturate public dialogue. So to take on the question of fake news or post-truth, we need to move beyond just correcting fake news and asking, why and how do people find things compelling and true or spreadable? And to answer these questions, we have to realize that fake news isn't an individual problem. It's a cluster problem. Which brings me to part 2, cultivating segregation. Now, to get us thinking about this, I'm going to show you part of a clip of the infamous Cambridge Analytica video, where they're explaining how they ran the Cruz campaign.
Clearly, demographics and geographics and economics will influence your worldview. But equally important, or probably more important, are psychographics. That is an understanding of your personality, because it's personality that drives behavior, and behavior that obviously influences how you vote. So how is this possible? Well, at Cambridge, we rolled out a long-form quantitative instrument to probe the underlying traits that inform personality. This is the cutting edge in experimental psychology known as the OCEAN model. OCEAN being an acronym for openness, how open you are to new experiences. Conscientiousness, whether you prefer order and habits and planning in your life. Extroversion, how social you are. Agreeableness, whether you put other people's needs and society and community ahead of yourself. And finally, neuroticism, a measurement of how much you tend to worry. By having hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans undertake this survey, we were able to form a model to predict the personality of every single adult in the United States of America. So how does this impact marketing and communications in elections? For a primary, the Second Amendment might be a popular issue amongst the electorate. If you know the personality of the people you're targeting, you can nuance your messaging to resonate more effectively with those key audience groups. So, for a highly neurotic and conscientious audience, you're going to need a message that is rational and fear-based or emotionally based. In this case, the threat of a burglary and the insurance policy of a gun is very persuasive. Conversely, for a closed and agreeable audience, these are people who care about tradition and habits and family and community. This could be the grandfather who taught his son to shoot and the father who will in turn teach his son. Obviously, talking about these values is going to be much more effective in communicating your message.
Okay, so Cambridge Analytica claimed that it knows your personality even if you never filled out your survey, because it's figured out proxies like buying an American car, buying MAC makeup, etc., that can determine your personality, right? So how many of you like Lady Gaga? Okay, at this point, I think it's just revealing how old you are. But apparently you're an extrovert. How many of you like philosophy? Okay, apparently you're introverts. So you'll note that even though they claim not to use race, the face of conscientious neuroticism is a well-groomed white female. And so, according to Christopher Wiley, who is the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, Bannon was the only straight man he met who understood feminist intersectional politics. So why we need to think class, gender, sexuality, and race together. And intersectionality theory comes from women of color feminists such as Kimberly Crenshaw. Bannon apparently sees culture as central to politics. He adheres to what's been called the Breitbart Doctrine. So the idea that you need to change culture in order to change politics. And according to Wiley, Cambridge Analytica took it one step further and argued that if you want to change culture, you have to change individuals, that individuals are the units of culture. So humanities and cultural studies, it would seem, aren't at the edge, they're at the center. In fact, they're what creates edges. Now, we need to take all these claims with a huge grain of salt. It's actually impossible to know what effect Cambridge Analytica really had on the elections. Right? There's just too many false positives. And blaming Cambridge Analytica or praising Cambridge Analytica for everything is, quite frankly, a cop-out. But what's crucial is that these ads and these campaigns were conceived as emotionally transformative experiences. The point of these ads was to change reality. The goal was to red pill you, to have you click on one link and then go down a rabbit hole, to lead you to a series of sites that said the same things over and over again, so you return a different person. Now, even though Cambridge Analytica claimed that individuals were the units of culture, what they sought to do was actually manipulate clusters. So the goal was to put you into an echo chamber with people like you, with people with whom you share a secret passion or a slight deviation, people you trust, people you share the same triggers with, and then get you to spam each other with this fake news. Right? So these ads are designed to accentuate fear, angst, and humor, to place people in a highly affective condition, because when you're most agitated and most affirmed, you act most predictably. And what's key is that folk are put into network neighborhoods not based on the majority of their likes or dislikes, but on their most intense or odd likes or dislikes. So based on how you deviate from the norm most like others. So based on what were considered to be your most authentic moments, where authenticity, being yourself, means being slightly deviant, means being a rebel, being alternative. And the point is to make everybody feel alternative, feel like a rebel, and then to string these groups together to form a majority. So consider this much cited and highly influential 2013 PNAS article, which revealed how easy it is to figure out a user's gender, sexuality, and politics based on publicly available Facebook evidence, Facebook likes, right? So in 2013, Facebook likes were public, they're now private, partly in response to studies like this. And they came up with predictions not only for physical traits, such as race and gender, but also psychological traits. And this is because almost 60,000 users, Facebook users, filled out a questionnaire, which Kaczynski then correlated into various personality types. Now, if these categories look familiar and Kaczynski rings a bell, it's because he's been linked to the whole Cambridge Analytica affair. To produce these results, the researchers basically created a vast user-like matrix, which they then decomposed into the 100 most relevant components. Okay, so what you see right now are the most correlated likes for IQ and sexuality. Look at these closely. So what's key is you matter, your actions matter, not in isolation, but in relation to others. Data is most valuable, most useful for prediction and identification only when it's authenticated with and against others deemed to be like you. So through your neighbors, through people deemed to be like you because they like what you like and they hate what you hate, you're captured even when you're silent. So Kaczynski used an initial training set of users and likes to come up with a weighted correlation matrix that was then used to predict the status of others. And this is much clearer in their 2015 article where they lay out their method for matching personality types. So they used 90% of the data as a training set to build a linear regression model, then tested it against the remaining 10%. So they predicted your identity or your personality type by weighing these manifest actions. So it's key is that Kaczynski didn't predict the future, he predicted the past. So these models are verified, they're true if they repeat the past, which means that if the past is racist and sexist, these models can only be verified as true if they repeat the past. Right? So consider this description of link prediction. Okay. What's key here is that the future, t+1, is calculated in the same way as missing information from the past, right? The likely future equals the missing past, right? So if you think about it, this is the most undisruptive conception of the future you can possibly have. Or perhaps what's so disruptive about it is that it precisely closes down the future, because it makes the future coincide with the past. Because we have to remember, this clustering isn't innocent. It creates and is used to create identities and borders. Again, what's important isn't the majority of likes, it's the likes that divide, right? So it's not that the majority of people who are deemed to have a high IQ liked curly fries, but those that are deemed not to have high IQs didn't like curly fries. Right? So these are odd, specialized likes that cluster because they divide. So the fact that society is more and more polarized is hardly surprising, because networks currently presume segregation. So at the heart of social networks, at the axiom of social networks, is something called homophily, which is the idea that birds of a feather flock together, that similarity breeds connection. Right? Homophily drives collaborative filtering, it groups users and items into certain clusters, into certain neighborhoods, and homophily structures networks by creating these clusters which then make the network searchable. But a really retrograde identity politics drives homophily. And what you see here is the definition of homophily from one of the most respected textbooks in network science. And I have nothing but the deepest respect for John Kleinberg and David Easley, but think of all the assumptions that are embedded in this statement. Think of everything you have to accept as natural for this to be true. Given the history of race within the US, such as the one-drop rule, what's at stake in calling race and ethnicity immutable? Given the growing inequality in the US, what does it mean to call where you live, your job, and your education mutable? And not surprisingly, US residential segregation is often given as evidence that homophily is true. But this only works if we actually erase the entire history of US residential segregation. There is no random start, right? Think of all the institutions, the training, the planning needed to make these true. Something that Grace Hale discussed in her discussion of segregation and how it sought to tie together race and space. Or something that Nightingale has investigated throughout the history of cities. And the links between homophily and US residential segregation are deep and profound. Right? So homophily was actually first termed in 1954 by the sociologists Lazarsfeld and Merton. And what's completely erased from all references to this article is referenced thousands upon thousands of times, right? Is the fact that they came up with the term homophily while studying US residential segregation. They also came up with the term heterophily, which has since disappeared. In particular, they came up with the term homophily to describe the relationship between white liberals and illiberals living in Hilltown, a biracial low-rent project of about 800 families in western Pennsylvania. So to prove the existence of value homophily, they focused solely on the responses of white liberals and illiberals. where liberalness was defined as believing that the races got along and that there should be desegregated housing, and the illiberals arguing the opposite. So in order to define this term, they actually threw out the responses of all the black residents, because all the black residents believed in desegregated housing. Because for the first time, white and black residents were both getting good housing at reasonable cost. So post-World War II, there was a lot of support for public housing, and public housing was nice. Right? So value homophily presumes racial segregation. Racial segregation is the culture from which value homophily emerges. To go back to the Cambridge Analytica example, what's key is that they were working on the Cruz primary campaign. And one difficulty they faced, as they make it clear in the bullet hole, is that bullet point, is that they faced an audience that was relatively homogeneous. So they used ocean to create boundaries within this homogeneous space. Again, homophily presumes a prior racial segregation. And not surprisingly, other studies of homophily have focused on enclosed neighborhoods, high schools, colleges. Facebook itself comes from liberal art colleges. Lazarsfeld and Merton actually drew inspiration from work that was done on Japanese internment camps. Through homophily, we have the swarming of the segregated neighborhood. Homophily presumes that neighborhoods should be segregated, so that if we manage to love our neighbors as ourselves, it's literally because they are ourselves. Through homophily, digital cultures are cultivated. Right? So to culture is to cultivate, to propagate, grow, or develop under artificial conditions or in a nutrient medium. Right? Culture is artificially natural. Culture is a land grab. Culture is the product of settler agriculture. Cultivation, tilling, cutting into the soil so microorganisms can reproduce literally ties culture and colony together. So culture and colony and cult all fork from the same Latin term colo, to till, cultivate, inhabit, protect, nurture, and worship. So a colonist was a settler, a Roman soldier farmer posted in foreign or hostile territory who occupied. Right? So cultures are invasive separations. Cultures are invasive separations, spaces of and for experimentation. Cultures, in other words, are glass petri dishes that house colonies of bacteria. They're beautifully cultivated, enclosed and enclosing, cloned and cloning spaces, spaces for breeding sameness through forking, segregating, and force feeding. Cultures are spaces in which invisible inherent natures are discovered. And they're importantly discovered through manipulation, by constructing model organisms both inside and outside these glass enclosures. So here you see a rendition of Griffith's experiments, which became central to the discovery of DNA. As you can tell from the slide, to the mass production and destruction of designer lab mice. So according to PETA, more than 1 million mice and rats are killed in US labs every year. Our cultures in our fishbowls may not seem so lethal, but as Kathy O'Neill has pointed out, many have become weapons of what she calls mass destruction. Weapons that enlighten through manipulation. And the key point is that manipulation isn't the side effect. Manipulation is the point. Right? So to offer you an early example, network scientist Barabazi has argued that our increasingly penetrating digital technologies places us in an immense research laboratory that in size, complexity, and detail surpasses everything that science has encountered before. And this lab reveals the rhythms of life as evidence of a deeper order of human behavior, one that can be explored, predicted, and no doubt exploited. Now, if anything, the claims made on behalf of network science and big data have only become larger. So Seth Stevens, a data scientist and contributing op-ed writer for the New York Times, argued that big data offers us a new look into human beings, their behaviors, desires, and natures. Right? Because big data allows us to concentrate on small subsets of people, and because big data allows us to undertake rapid causal experiments. So we're segregated, transplanted, and cloned not in order to transform and discover our DNA, but rather a segregated non-conscious. And like these experiments, what's key is cultivating deviation. Cultivating deviation so we can be authenticated. So consider this recent study of radicalization of alternative information networks on YouTube. And this was done by Rebecca Lewis of Data and Society. And what's key is the creation of an alternative universe of authenticity and authority. What's key is cultivating the notion that these people are underdogs, as well as the modes of authentication and user verification and branding used to establish alternative universe, as well as different modes of participation. Okay, so if this is true, what can we do? So very briefly, part 3, beyond verification. So what if? What if without letting go of the importance of verification, we took on the thorny question of authenticity? So one of the projects that my group is working on is called Beyond Verification and is looking at this through this rubric. So the idea is to understand why and how things register as authentic without assuming that users are naive, stupid, or cynical. So as numerous studies have shown, users who inadvertently or deliberately spread fake news are politically engaged, they're avid readers, and they want to vote. Right? They tend to be educated and wealthy. And conspiracy theories just don't spread on Facebook, right? They also spread on other sites. And further, social media users aren't stupid, right? They carefully craft persona with online public engagement in mind, right? So think about Instagram. Right? They enact parts of themselves aspirationally as brands. So as Sarah Benet-Weiser has argued in her definitive Authentic TM, authenticity is central to the ambivalent operations of the consumer citizen. So authenticity is now a brand. Right? Selves and corporations are carefully crafted to ensure authenticity. And brands are all about creating an authentic relationship, a certain structure of feeling. And these authentic personas are neither correct nor incorrect. Because authenticity has always, and this is something the literary critic Lionel Trilling has argued, been dramatic. Authenticity has always been linked to the notion of the tragic hero, to performances or demonstrations of authenticity. It's fundamentally literary and performative. So authenticity isn't being transparent. Authenticity is not sincerity. So according to Trilling's provocative and much-cited analysis of authenticity, authenticity emerged in the 20th century as a reaction against sincerity, a term that gained traction in the 17th and 18th centuries. So sincerity and authenticity, Trilling argued, follow the same imperative, to thine own self be true, but differ fundamentally in why being true to yourself matters. So sincerity adheres to Polonius's advice to his son in Hamlet, to thine own self be true, and it doth follow as night to day, thou canst not then be false to any man. So sincerity is algorithmic. Right? It's following a command. And Trilling stresses that sincerity calls for oneself to be true to yourself so you can be true to others. Right? It's a means to an end. right? So Hillary Clinton was vilified over and over as being sincere, right? So whenever she did something authentic, it was viewed as a means to an end. Right? Now, according to Trilling, sincerity was linked to the rise of society and tries to make the personal and the public correspond. So Rousseau in the novel embodies sincerity, a certain way of dealing with cities. In contrast, he argues, authenticity simply corresponds to the first sentence. Authenticity is simply to thine own self be true. So it's still algorithmic, but it's short. Right? And authenticity, therefore, he argues, doesn't face the public, but rather one's own inner self. It's an end, not a means. So authenticity, Trilling argues, exposes cultural norms and niceties as fake. And Trilling, importantly, was writing during the Vietnam War, during protests for Vietnam War. And he argues that at the behest of the criterion of authenticity, much that was once thought up to make the very fabric of culture has come to seem of little account, mere fantasy or ritual, downright falsification. Conversely, much that culture traditionally condemned and sought to exclude is accorded considerable moral authority by reason of authenticity claimed for it. For example, disorder, violence, unreason. So confrontation is central to authenticity and to the mode of identification it entails. And what's key, and what I don't have enough time to expand on here, is that Trilling's wrong because confrontation still implies relation, right? So persona become authentic through interchanges and platform-based rights of liking, sharing, etc., etc. So these networks, again, gain credibility by cultivating and appealing to and grouping users as underdogs, as alternatives. They create alternative information networks that establish an alternative sense of credibility based on relatability, authenticity, and accountability. So authenticity has become a way to teach humans how to behave slightly badly so they become more predictable. So there's a reason why authenticity is actually the buzzword amongst management circles and self-branders. Why workers are encouraged to be authentic. So here you see, this drives me crazy about the Valley, right? PJ days. Do you really want to see all your fellow programmers in PJs, right? The idea that you have to expose your secret in the workplace, right? Because otherwise you're hiding something. Now, there's a reason as well why the 2016 elections were called the authenticity elections, right? As well as the fake news elections. So the resurgence of authenticity in the 21st century, as many have noted, seems counterintuitive. Right? So in the era of rampant globalization and digitization, the age of the copy, the notion of an authoritative original hardly seems credible. So as Chandra Mukherjee has put it, American popular culture is obsessed with authenticity and awash with artificiality. Perhaps. But what's key, and what can I only gesture towards, and hopefully these examples make clear, is that authenticity isn't easily separable from artificiality. Right? So the most authentic politician in 2016 was a reality TV star. Right? Kylie Jenner is a billionaire. Reality TV is perhaps the most artificial, most scripted, and most generic form of TV there is. In fact, it's sold as format TV. It's understood to be entirely a format. Right? So authenticity has become so central because it's become algorithmic. That is, if it, however, wasn't algorithmic. That is a set of rules to be followed and executed. Again, at the very simplest, authenticity is the command to your own self be true. Now, by calling authenticity algorithmic, I want to do more than highlight the methodological nature of authenticity. So the term algorithmic authenticity reveals the ways in which users are validated and authenticated by network algorithms. So the imperative to be true to yourself, or more simply, be true, makes our data valuable, that is recognizable across the many media platforms we use. Right? So how many of you have the same password across platforms? Exactly. That most intimate, most personal piece of your self, right? Fundamentally about recognition, algorithmic authenticity buttresses human and machinic pattern recognition. Algorithmic authenticity ties together allegedly separate or even competing agents and programs. But again, authenticity can't be reduced to authentication. So to move beyond verification, let's acknowledge and engage these points, right? Verification is important, but not enough. People aren't stupid. Just saying something's fake isn't enough, right? So what if, in order to combat this, we treated and try to understand ourselves as characters within a drama that we so poorly call big data? What if we actually thought through the scripts and the larger network we're embedded in? And what if we also revisited these correlations in order to explode them? Right? So what would happen if we took seriously the fact that Wu-Tang Clan is apparently one of the most correlated likes for male heterosexuality? What would we do with this mix of Hong Kong martial arts cinema, Staten Island hip-hop, and Jacques Cousteau? Right? So what would happen, in other words, if we actually engage the ways in which we're all entangled, the ways in which our actions affect others, the ways in which any individual is collectively formed? Right? So what would happen if we weren't shunted into homophilous networks? Right? What would happen actually if these lines represented not similarity but difference? Right? What if we took up this notion of heterophilia, or the idea that opposites can attract? This is how electricity works. How many of you know people who are heterosexual? Apparently it can work. Right? Or better yet, what if we even took mutual indifference as grounds for connection? The fact that we all sit on these chairs, right? What if we started thinking through mutual indifference precisely as those things that tie us together? Right? That is, what if we took the Combahee Collective's challenge to treat all people as levelly human? And this collective of Black women were one of the first to theorize what's become intersectionality. So the importance, again, of thinking race, sexuality, class, and gender together. So Cambridge Analytica draws from their work. But it's from their embrace of identity that they call for a level humanity, for a recognition that belies pattern recognition. So let's engage connection and the humanities in order to keep the future open. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions from the audience.
I really am struck by that conclusion. That sounds fantastic from an ideological perspective, but it makes me wonder about homophilous spaces that are still broken in terms of communication. So for me, speaking with a family who's very much like me for most of my life, but those separate opinions, especially politically now, still create a divide that can't be bridged. And that strikes me as pretty hopeless in my perspective. I don't know how to...
But actually that's a great example, and that's often an example I use, right? So family gatherings are usually one of the most awful things. I mean, people, the best sign I ever saw outside a liquor store was, "Holidays are coming, buy now." But what that brings out is that the very presumption of homophilia, if you go through the literature, it's that homophilia is important because people are comfortable. right? But if you think about it, it's actually homophilous spaces which are incredibly uncomfortable. And that's the point. So let's explode that myth, right? And try to understand when homophily works, because there are certain times where it certainly does work, right? Understand why it works, but also understand what it can't explain and what it covers over. So, like Thanksgiving.
So how, and I don't know if there's an answer to this yet, but I'm wondering how would we take this sort of very awesome ideological theory, and how would we sort of convince, or how do we use capitalism how do we convince the people who, create these networks that we're all part of because we're, all on social media? Like how would we be able to shift those, or is it too late for those and we just need to go to something new that organizes people differently?
That's a great question. So one thing we need to keep in mind is the notion of needing to disrupt homophily is actually something the Valley's interested in. Because if you think about homophily, it means that people are buying the same things over and over again, and they want you to buy something different, right? So the question that they're looking at in terms of randomness or heterophily, they want to figure out different ways to make you react, right? So it's not as if this is outside of capitalism, right? The other thing is, one thing that they're struggling with is trying to understand exactly what it means for them to be media companies. And this is where the humanities is so important, because all of a sudden they can no longer hide behind being technological companies, right? So understanding what it means to be a media company and that the whole structure is really important. So what I love about the Beyond Verification project is one argument it's really making is that if you want to understand what's happening now with fake news, you have to understand soap operas. And the way soap operas operated, right? So they were supposed to intersect in people's days, you were supposed to take it in and out, you were rewarded. The more soap operas you watched, the more you learned, you knew, right? So it's, and this is reality TV. So in other words, we need to have that sort of media understanding engaged with it. But that this is clearly a question that itself has been thought through precisely as a way to disrupt and to expand markets.
I really like this talk, and it, giving me a lot to think about. But in some ways, I feel like you're restating a conflict that is already existing, right? That there's a kind of a political subset of people who kind of want to fence themselves in, and they want to be among the same people, and they have this kind of constant fear of the other, right? And then there's the others who embrace diversity, right? I mean, it feels like you're in some ways you're restating the same conflict, and it doesn't feel like, kind of emphasizing diversity or anything will convince the other side that this is the way to go. Right?
There's a couple of things here. One is first to bring out the historical nature of this. So if we're at a point now where it seems as if groups do want to fence themselves in, it's because the only option is homophily. The only option right now is similarity breeds connection. So the idea that diversity could breed connection isn't even there. Okay, one. And secondly, again, one thing I'm pushing against in terms of heterophily is that heterophily isn't necessarily the answer. It's something that exists that we need to think through. But I think actually mutual indifference is far more interesting. What if we thought about the network as everything that was outside the lines, that linked everything together? So I think that what I'm doing is trying to occupy that space. First of all, to say, so the larger trajectory of the book looks at the relationship between eugenics and data science, so the history of correlation as well as linear regression, et cetera, not in order to say data science is eugenics, but to try to understand what sort of future it tries to put in place. Like, what does correlation actually do? And what's interesting about the eugenic moment versus our moment right now is that the eugenicists, so Davenport wrote this crazy book about eugenics, and it was basically a marriage manual. And it was like, why do people not marry well? Right? So I'm going to show you that you need to marry well, and this is what you need to do to marry well, et cetera, because racially well, right? But his problem was, why doesn't similarity breed connection? We're now in a world where we've moved from statistics to data neighborhoods, in which it's assumed that similarity breeds connection. That's a different space. So part of it is to tease out those differences.
I was wondering what you thought exactly the future of the so-called town square would be. That we see all of these internet companies where we commute and where we talk are now all private industries. And that in a sense cannot be touched by government regulations, and they have the ability to shut down who they want, push ideology that they want, and that's all legal. So where do you think that is going to go in the coming decades as we increasingly only talk online in a form that can essentially be censored how they please?
I mean, that's a really important question. I mean, it goes into all sorts of questions about net neutrality as well as regulation. I mean, one thing we have to realize is that the world is very different. And what we consider the internet in America isn't the internet in other places. And that's both good and bad, because some places are pretty scary. But I think what that brings out is that there isn't anything that's inevitable. Right now we have what's called FAGA, right? Facebook, Amazon, Google, Apple. You could also call it GAFA. I like FAGA because you just add an N to it and you get Fagan. So we need an N. Netflix, fine. Okay. But I do think that that question is one that needs to be thought through. And a lot of people are also looking at the old technologies, or they're not old, but they're not that old, and they're actually, anyway, of mesh networks, right? So part of it is to try to think through hardware, the ways we engage. And I have to tell you, I was, so my undergraduate degree is in engineering, and I worked back in the old days of 802.3.10 base T, which is when Ethernet was going from cable to telco. Now, what was interesting about working on engineering protocol is that you realized how open your data is, right? So think of how your wireless card operates, and this is something I brought up this afternoon. So when your computer there, if you have your wireless on, yeah, you're downloading everybody's traffic. And everybody's downloading your traffic that's also on the network. And then what your network card does is actively delete the traffic that's not directly addressed to you. Okay. Now, when you can see everybody else's data, your computer is in what's called promiscuous mode. Promiscuous mode is a technical term. There is nothing called monogamous mode because a network computer in monogamous mode just wouldn't work. Right? So if data is being circulated, if we're downloading each other's traffic all the time, if there is something fundamentally public about it or open about it, how can we deal with this? How can we engage with it and understand this kind of publicness instead of retreating to some notion of security or privacy, which means that only Facebook owns our stuff? Right? So I think what we need is a rigorous discussion of what it is that is public and start with the ways in which our technologies actually operate and use that as a way in. And there's no reason why, as well, that all this stuff should be stored. I mean, that's a huge problem. It's not only destroying the world, right? Think of all the server farms. If you want to save the world, print out something important and delete it. Right? So if you think about it, the politics of storage, that's another thing that we need to discuss, as well as to open up the possibilities and not to believe we can't intervene, because there's places where people have.
I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about this idea that online persona ought to be tied to a verifiable human persona. Something I was thinking about throughout your talk is the fact that my understanding is that a lot of clicks are done by non-human things. I was listening to a podcast about how there's these bands on Spotify that are algorithmically generated music and all the plays are farmed out. The kind of like connection that you're talking about toward the end, it seems difficult with this weird gooey media of like fake stuff everywhere. But I don't know what the solution is, and I've heard this verifiable ID thing, but I don't know what to think about it. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts about that. One is, it's kind of interesting to think about, so there are a lot of bots writing for bots right now. So some really interesting work is about what happens to writing when most writing is done by bots for bots? How does that change our understanding of what literature is? But what's interesting about bots as well, in terms of buying and selling them, is that it's not new, right? So there were, since the very beginning of a lot of these things, once you started tallying clicks, right? You had this. So one way to get away from it is actually to get away from the notion of a clickbait economy, right? What if clicks didn't matter? What if retweets didn't matter? Then a lot of this question and the influence would go away. But secondly, so what's difficult about the question of verifiability is that it was premised initially as a way to make people more secure, right? It was said that it would fight against bullying, right? That somehow if these were verifiable, then we wouldn't have all the internet wouldn't be a trash fire, right? We have verifiability and we have a worse trash fire. Because if anyone suffered from cyberbullying, they know that actually it's more effective when the user IDs are verified. Like so in other words, verifiability hasn't gotten rid of the problem of aggression. So when it was posed as that which would solve all our political problems for us, it hasn't. So then we have to ask ourselves, okay, what is verifiability doing? Who's pushing for it? And how can we understand it? But saying that someone's a character is actually quite interesting because it doesn't necessarily go against the idea is that you don't know who the actor is. But an actor takes on various characters, right? So it's not saying that a person can't be many other things, but it's denying that there's some sort of one essential core. So that's where a character, in thinking through that notion of a character, is really interesting in relationship to drama and acting.
I'm just curious, have you thought about civil disobedience and issues of like Tim Leary's notion of dropping out? Because I'm thinking that notions of manipulation of public notions and ideology and such, it certainly is nothing new. And so various things have been used in the past to counteract the hegemonic ways of big whatever. And so I'm just curious, are you a proponent of people not participating in these forums as a way to enhance their voice in other forums?
Okay, so if you don't participate, you're still profiled. You're profiled as somebody who doesn't participate, right? So, so in that sense, that sort of exit doesn't seem possible. But secondly, I'm very suspicious of exit politics because you know that Peter Thiel is not planning to live with us when climate change happens, right? So they've all bought their swaths of land in New Zealand. Have you all heard of seasteading? That's a new thing, yeah. So they bought this French Polynesian island and they're going to build it up to 3D levels so that when the I can't say that word. When something bad happens there, they can escape, right? But this notion of escape, I mean, there's this book called The Sovereign Individual by Mies Bogg, and it was written at the same time cyberspace was taking off. So it's at the end of the last century, right? And it's when you have all the utopian stuff about cyberspace. And there they make the argument that what cyberspace enables is escape. It's escape from sovereignty, and that we'll have sovereign individuals instead. We're going to have the end of work. They say work will end. We're going to have some very rich people and the rest will be poor. This is what cyberspace will bring. But so the very rich people need to become sovereign individuals, right? So this was like written, and this apparently is one of the most influential texts for Peter Thiel. So I think that we need to think through the notion of exit for whom it's put in place, and how it operates. But at the same time, what I would say is I think we need a more rigorous notion of privacy. We need a more rigorous notion of privacy, and we need a more rigorous notion of publicity. Because privacy can't mean corporations keeping you secure. We need to rethink what we mean by privacy, and we need to rethink what we mean by publicity in order to have stronger definitions of the two. And that doesn't mean escape, that doesn't mean exit, that means engagement.
But is civil disobedience escapism or a form of escape? Like, I don't necessarily...
Oh, no. Sorry, I forgot the first part of your question. Yeah, no, I think that the question of civil disobedience is really important, especially because often forms of civil disobedience online play with being verified but differently, right? So checking in at places where you are, swamping the network. So you think of DDoS attacks, which were first formulated by the Electronic Disturbance Theater in different ways of trying to think through civil disobedience. But what's important about civil disobedience is that it's always a catch-up game with trackability. So in that sense, there has to be an engagement with it and an understanding of it. So Tad Hirsch, came up with one of the first applications which allegedly inspired Twitter, and it was called TextMob. And so it was used at both the DNC and RNC conventions, and what it would do is it was basically a listserv for cell phones. And it would say, well, you know, cops are coming down Main Street, move, right? And so it was a way of organizing. Okay. Now, of course, even though there were different levels of privacy, the cops were on it. And not only were the police on it, they also subpoenaed Tad to get all that information. So that question of trust and storing is a really key one when we think through how civil disobedience can operate.
Your notion of a network connected with difference or mutual indifference, what would you say is the impact of what we think we know of as democracy?
What would the impact be in terms of democracy?
Yeah.
You see, I said the question of democracy is so important, and yet most theories of democracy are like that theory of pornography. I know it when I see it. And I think that what's absolutely key is to try to understand what we mean by democracy and to ask ourselves to what extent is what's happening now giving us the opportunity to understand and rethink what we thought we knew about democracy. Clearly there are some theories that are more compelling than others. You know, the notion of agonism is a key one. Also the idea of a certain radical openness or an emptiness at the center of power, which enables anybody and nobody to be at the center of power, is another key notion in democracy. But I think that what we're facing, and this is why I started the Digital Democracies Group, is to say, look, we need to do something, and we need to realize that we can't just say this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this doesn't work, which is often true. But let's take these things that all don't work and see what we can learn from them. And maybe that means our theoretical frame of mind has to change. Rather than trying to make the world fit a certain theoretical frame of mind, maybe we need to change our theoretical frame of mind.